This podcast serves Middle Tennessee every weekday morning, and it's made possible by member support. Learn how you can make a difference at WPLN.org/support.
This is the Nashvillager Podcast. It's October 28th, 2025. This day in 1962 marked the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the closest our nation and the USSR ever came to actual nuclear war. The tension began when the Soviets secretly began constructing missile bases in Cuba, much, much closer to the U.S. than any of their known bases. President Kennedy responded with a letter to the Soviet premier insisting the silos be dismantled and all offensive weapons be sent back to the Soviet Union. He also appeared on TV, telling the American public what was happening, announcing a naval blockade of Cuba, and stating very clearly that if the Soviets fired nuclear weapons on us, he was prepared to retaliate in kind. For days, it was a standoff, a very tense one. Further surveillance showed the construction in Cuba was completed. The Soviets demanded the U.S. remove its missiles from Turkey. An American reconnaissance jet was shut down over Cuba. There were countless tense diplomatic conversations between D.C. and Moscow, some through back channels, others carried out directly, albeit in writing, between Kennedy and Khrushchev. Finally, on this day, Khrushchev backed down. The crisis was averted, but only after millions of people spent several very panicky, very long days trying to reckon with the very real possibility that thermonuclear warfare might be headed their way. I'm Nina Cardona, and this is your daily digest of what's happening around Middle Tennessee with historical context from Nashville Public Radio, WPLN News. My parents were teenagers during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and when I was growing up, it's one of those memories they would sometimes bring up if they were talking to other adults. As a kid, I can't say I really understood what it was, especially since they could just make a vague reference and everyone who lived through it would know exactly what they were talking to. But I remember being able to tell with absolute confidence that whatever had happened, it was scary. Really, really scary. It made a definite impact. One very visible impact is that the White House and Kremlin agreed soon after to establish a direct phone connection between the president and the Soviet premier, the famous red phone. The crisis also kicked many U.S. states into high gear in terms of figuring out how to handle the emergency response side of things if we ever did have a nuclear missile heading our way. Now, there had been all kinds of concern about that sort of thing ever since the first A-bombs were dropped on Japan. And of course, that tension mounted through the 50s while the Soviets got the hang of making their own nuclear arsenal, and the Cold War turned more and more tense. But when it came to funneling that concern into real, actionable plans, things had been a little more unfocused and unrealistic. State and federal officials did substantial work to index where people and businesses are so they could try and predict potential sites an enemy might want to target. That work was thorough. I saw an example of it a few decades later when my uncle, who worked in the Pentagon, brought us a surplus, declassified map of our town that had been made in the 50s. It showed every structure in Smyrna at the time, with little numbers on each building to indicate how many people lived or worked there when the map was made. Obviously, it was way out of date by the time I saw it. That's why he was allowed to have it. But the point is, it was as intense as it was fascinating, but it was also a little unfocused. The state military department's history of that era says there were a lot of ideas being thrown around at that time for how to best evacuate Tennessee's largest cities. The population of Memphis, for example, could be scattered all over West Tennessee if need be. An old school building near Tullahoma was picked to be the emergency state capital if folks had to abandon Nashville. Never mind that there probably wouldn't be anywhere near enough of a heads up for that kind of mobilization before a nuke hit. But that's the thing. In the 50s, it was a real and present fear, but it was also nebulous and not exactly dialed into the true implications and possibilities. The Cuban Missile Crisis changed that. The experience of going from theoretical, maybe one day, to the possibility of maybe this afternoon, didn't just scare the pants off of state and local leaders. It helped them see the holes in their plans. And so once the crisis was averted, work began on crafting a better mechanism for responding to that kind of disaster in Tennessee. It took a little time, but 4 years later, the state adopted the blandly named Tennessee Plan for Management of Resources. By resources, they meant everything that becomes vital when there's an emergency: the electric and telecommunications grids, food, water, fuel, industrial materials. The plan got very granular about what responsibilities would be handled by the state, which things would be in local hands, and what was up to the feds. Every department in the state government was ordered to catalog critical functions that could need protection if resources became tight. And they got very serious about designating potential shelter locations in case of nuclear fallout. It was a level of coordination the state's emergency response agencies had never attempted before. And while the threat of nuclear attack isn't the pressing danger it once was, we still see the vestiges of that plan in action every time there's a disaster in this state. What started as a nuclear readiness effort is now the coordination plan that plays out every time the weather turns dangerously stormy. In just a few minutes, this is Nashville Gets a Little Slithery. That's coming up after the newscast.
Does WPLN have a number one fan? Is it you? Are you the one who heard all of the 1,100 some odd local stories that we broadcast the past year? Tip of the cap. I'm News Director Tony Gonzalez, and I know that doing this much local reporting depends on you deciding to donate. Do it for the best story you heard this year, or for all 1,100. WPLN is here for good. Donate at WPLN.org/give.
Here's the latest from WPLN News. An independent federal agency that investigates industrial chemical accidents is now looking into the fatal explosion at Accurate Energetic Systems facility. Earlier this month, 16 people were killed in what has been described as one of the deadliest industrial explosions in the U.S. The ATF, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, conducted a preliminary investigation. It estimates that between 24,000 and 28,000 pounds of explosives detonated in a building where explosive materials were heated. Now it's time for the U.S. Chemical Safety and Hazards Investigation Board to step in. It will look not only into the root cause of the incident, but also make recommendations to prevent future explosions. Construction began this week on a gas pipeline that will stretch more than 120 miles across Tennessee. Enbridge is building the pipeline to carry methane from rural Middle Tennessee to Kingston, where the Tennessee Valley Authority is building a large gas plant. WPLN's Caroline Eggers has more.
This whole project started years before it was finalized. TVA set up an agreement with Enbridge, a company that makes billions of dollars each year selling gas on its pipelines. Project details have been opaque, literally. The Southern Environmental Law Center brought a suit against TVA to investigate the deal with Enbridge, and got a lot of blacked-out text in return. And last year, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency said TVA should not really be building gas, but rather a cheaper and cleaner option like solar to reduce air pollution and emissions that cause climate change. But TVA pushed forward, and Enbridge has now started construction. The pipeline will transport methane across multiple states, likely from the Pennsylvania fracking region, down into and across a fourth of Tennessee. On the way, the pipeline will cross hundreds of streams, 300 wetlands, tributaries of the Obed Wild and Scenic River, water bodies on the National Rivers Inventory list, and 6 exceptional Tennessee waters. It will also cut through forest and near people's homes. Caroline Eggers, WPLN News.
Former state lawmaker Robin Smith will head to federal prison for fraud. She is now sentenced to 8 months. That's after pleading guilty in 2022 for her role in a bribery and kickback mail fraud scheme. She made a plea deal to cooperate with investigators and prosecutors against former House Speaker Glenn Cassada and his top aide Cade Cothran. In admitting to the crime, Smith says she got caught up in the, quote, theatrics of politics, end quote. Last month, Cassada was sentenced to 36 months and Cothran got 30 months. Wearable silent panic alarms for Tennessee public school teachers will be on the upcoming legislative agenda. A group of state lawmakers announced last week they will seek funding to furnish all public schools with such alarm buttons. The alarms are worn on a lanyard and alert first responders and police immediately to emergencies. It would be an expansion of a pilot program that equipped select schools, some private, some public, with such alarms in 2024. That program cost $48,000. The demand was high last year. More than 70 schools and districts applied to be a part of the pilot, although only 6 were granted. Now, State Representative Ron Gant and Senate Majority Leader Jack Johnson have proposed a bill that would increase access to all public school districts that want to partake. They anticipate the program would cost roughly $20 million. Sewage concerns in Wilson County have prompted a 6-month pause on a type of system that has triggered state violations. County commissioners are worried about step systems, which use septic tanks and drainage fields instead of municipal sewer lines. Wilson County has learned that it has among the most violations in the state because of the use of residential step systems, and that neighborhoods have been dealing with foul-smelling ponding of wastewater. The county has contracted with the company Adinas on its step system since 2001. The issue has come to a head recently, prompting a lawsuit from an environmental advocacy group. One high-profile issue is at the new LaGuardo Elementary, where an emergency contract has allowed sewage to be hauled to Lebanon for treatment. Tennessee is experiencing some of the highest rates of parvovirus. It's an intestinal and contagious virus that affects dogs, and owners are being warned to get their pets vaccinated. Young dogs and unvaccinated dogs are the most vulnerable. Outbreaks tend to go up in the spring and summer as more dogs spend time outside. Reports have discovered 515 cases, and just a few months back, the cases were around 100. Signs to look for are low energy, loss of appetite, and vomiting. Davidson and Dixon counties have the highest rates. You'll find more news anytime at WPLN.org. For years, people would come to WPLN station events and say, "You guys ought to have a daily show." And we'd have to answer that to do it right would take more staff and more resources than we were even close to being able to wrangle up. And it was true. I mean, there are places that throw daily shows together with basically just the host doing everything. But frankly, unless that host is a miracle worker, they tend to just sound thrown together. Like that podcast your buddy tried and quit after 4 painful episodes, except without the quitting part. Here at WPLN, we didn't want to do a daily show unless we could do it the right way to make it really high quality. And so, even when the listener support grew to the point that we could finally truly staff out a show, there was still a little trepidation. Are we actually ready for this move? Will it find its momentum, its place in the landscape of conversations in and about Nashville? And guys, I say all that to make you realize just how big deal it is to be able to say, I'm really very, very proud of what This Is Nashville has become. It's only been a few years since we got the show up and running, but it's become such a great vehicle for community conversations, sometimes about difficult and hard-hitting topics, about what's happening in politics, but also just about who we are as people who live in this place and how we interact with the world around us. About, as NPR's Linda Holmes likes to say, our little weirdsies. In just a moment, we're going to listen to a really fun conversation from a recent episode of This Is Nashville. But before I hit play, this is fall fundraising time. As I said, a show this good doesn't happen without the kind of listener support that makes it possible to hire a staff of creative, resourceful producers who can take the time to find the people who make these conversations great. What we're about to hear is another fantastic example of what you pay for when you give at WPLN.org. And with that said, let's listen now to host Blake Farmer talk to folks about snakes.
We're going to bring in another voice to the conversation here. Lisa Powers is the founding president of the Tennessee Herpetological Society and is also very familiar with and fond of the snakes of Middle Tennessee. Lisa, welcome to This Is Nashville.
Thanks, Blake. Pleasure to be here.
Well, tell me about your backyard, because I understand you also are trying to attract snakes, not drive them away.
I do. I've got cover tin and cover boards that I've placed out at the back end of my property that provides moisture and also cover for rodents and such. And then I've also got some rock piles and some brush piles. And up until I started the brush piles, I never found a copperhead in my yard. And I was so excited to find my first copperhead a few years back. And then last year I had 2. And hopefully I'll see them back again this year.
Okay, so you are in Hickman County, but I'm trying to imagine how the neighbors feel about you trying to attract copperheads.
Well, my neighbors are pretty laid back for the most part,
Okay.
and I have a pretty good-sized lot that's about 2 acres, and it backs up to a wooded forest.
Okay.
So they will come get me if they find one in their yard, and I'll move whatever back to my side or out to the woods again. But they call me the snake lady or the bug lady, depending on what I'm doing at the time.
But truly, does it win you friends? I mean, are they okay with this, or they put up with this?
I think they've grown to appreciate it somewhat. The neighbors on one side, I'm not so sure about. I'm sure they think my yard's a jungle. They're
Just
the type,
like you like it.
They're the type that mow like twice a week,
Gotcha.
and the yard's extra short. But
Yeah, I need you to come work on my husband about that. I need
Wait,
some-
because your husband wants to clean up the yard instead of have the rock piles and
Pretty
the
much.
and the falling down shed
so
or
I
something.
can't attract the snakes that I want to.
Well, I guess the answer is if you want the snakes, pile some stuff up, and if you don't, get rid of the piles, and there
exactly.
you go. Okay. Well, there's your first tip of the morning, the day. So I wonder. This came up with our last caller. They were trying to say he, she, they. They weren't sure how to tell gender. How do you tell the difference between a he or she with a snake?
For most snakes, it's not apparent.
Is that
right? You actually have to handle the snake to find that out. There are a few species where we have male-to-male combat, and the male snakes are generally larger, like in the timber rattlesnake and the cottonmouth and the copperhead. But most snakes, it's just a guess, and you don't know for sure until they either give birth, if they give live birth, or they lay eggs.
Wow. Let's go back to the phones. Becca from Nashville, you're live on the air. What's your snake story?
Hi. My snake story happened about 13 years ago. We live in rural Davidson County, kind of out in the woods, and it was cicada season. And I had gone out my back door and walked into a kind of a walled garden I have, and I heard a cicada. And then I realized I don't hear cicadas in singles. And I looked down, and 3 feet from me was a rattlesnake in my garden. And I thought I was alone. My husband was out of town, and my first thought was, if I go back inside, I don't know where this snake is going. And it was really close to my house and the dogs and my cat. So I did what I thought I should do. I ran inside, grabbed a glass of wine, grabbed a chair, grabbed my phone, came back out, and sat eye to eye with that snake. We love snakes out here, but not rattlesnakes that close to me. And so I called a couple of friends that I knew how to rehome a rattlesnake, but I couldn't reach them. So finally I had to call a friend who could just come take care of it for me. But that snake and I sat eye to eye waiting for about 30 minutes.
Wow.
And I didn't go anywhere, and he didn't go anywhere.
Well, and when you say take care of it, what do you mean?
He had to kill it.
Yeah.
He killed it.
Yeah.
And, I just felt like it was too close to my house and my animals and to us. We usually, we're not in favor of killing snakes, but in this situation, I couldn't reach my friends who could come capture it.
In future, I would suggest using a water hose and spraying cold water onto it. And that discourages them. And they do have a memory, and they do not like bad memories and will tend to avoid that next time around.
Interesting. That's really good information. Thank you.
Yeah. Lisa, thanks for sharing that. And Becca, thank you for sharing your rattlesnake story. I didn't know, once we grabbed the bottle of wine, I wasn't sure where we were going with it. But I love that you spent some time with the rattler. Lindsay, how often do you have people, coming across rattlesnakes in Middle Tennessee?
I don't think it's as often as you would think. Because of the Tennessee Snake page, we get that a lot. There's so many snakes. They're everywhere. They're really not. And they don't like humans. They don't want to be around us. They just want to live out in their habitat.
The
Lisa.
vast majority of Middle Tennesseans will never, ever see a venomous snake.
That snake episode of This is Nashville was such a hit that they recently had one about spiders, complete with a guest who brought an 8-legged friend with them into the studio. not going to lie, I'm a little relieved I was the guest host the day after the spiders. But later this week, I will be making an appearance on This Is Nashville as a guest to talk with Blake about this podcast, what goes into making it, and the thought process behind it. I hope you'll consider tuning in to hear our conversation. We do that kind of thing once in a while because we know you are curious people who like to know how things work, and because we want you to know where your money goes. Because truly, none of what happens at Nashville Public Radio would be possible if it weren't for those of you who donate. Thank you so much for your financial support. Whether it's a one-time gift or a sustaining monthly donation, you make a tremendous difference. Give now at WPLN.org. And that's it for today. Thanks so much for listening. Let's make this day a good one, and we'll catch back up tomorrow.